together, and then we create a book market measure that basically informs publishers, booksellers, and distributors about what's selling in the market in any given week, and then we can also kind of start to work out trends from that, and things like that. So that's very basically what we do at BookScans specifically.
Interesting. And that's for South Africa as a market?
Yes, that's right. So I operate in the South African market specifically, but Nielsen Book Data does operate in territories all across the world. So globally, we operate in the UK and Ireland, Australia, New Zealand, Mexico, and Colombia as well. But those territories are handled by different colleagues,
right,
all under the same business.
Right. And you're gathering the data on international and South African and African books sold within South Africa, not just South African books. So it's the
yes,
universe.
So any book, yeah, that's right. Any
Amazing.
book that's listed and then sold in the South African market gets measured.
Amazing. So can I blame you for low sales? When I have low sales in my novels, I get to blame you.
People typically do.
Thank you. Next up on our panel is Griffin Shea, who I can now say is Dr. Griffin Shea. Congratulations, Griffin. I think you just got your PhD this week, which is kind of astonishing. I know you do so much. So how you fit that in, I have no idea. Griffin, I'm sure many of you are aware, is a journalist turned publisher. Griffin's also a literary activist in Johannesburg, but I mean, obviously that stretches across South Africa and Africa. When he moved to South Africa, Griffin noticed the scarcity of African literature in mainstream shops. And so it sounds simple. He founded a bookshop called Bridge Books in 2016, which is in downtown Johannesburg, and it's dedicated largely to African writers. Griffin also launched the African Book Trust, which is a nonprofit that donates books by South African authors to libraries and schools. And he conducts a lot of research into Joburg's informal book trade, which is a lot of what his PhD was about. And on top of that, because that isn't all enough, he's also an author in his own right. So, Griffin, I read somewhere that about 75% of the books in your store, Bridge Books, are African authored. And you're very well known for a very deliberate choice to prioritize local voices. And what interests me about that is that you were born in America. Can you tell us briefly where this interest and passion stem from? What's your superpower origin story?
Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, not an uncommon one for people who land in the space. But when my own children were much younger, so kind of 15 years ago, my kids are both adopted. And so we were looking for books they're both reluctant readers, trying to find books that would resonate with them. And it was really hard. And we were in the big bookstores and not finding any books with like black or brown kids in them, hardly at all. And we had this experience where I was like, we went into a big store, I'm like, go wild. There is no budget. Choose whatever you want. He did not find anything in the store that they wanted to read. And so I went digging and I was like, well, maybe if I find a local story, he's been raised his entire life in South Africa. He wants, maybe there's something South African that would speak to him. And the only book at that time, which had African kids in it, was about the Lost Boys of Sudan. I was really aiming for a firefighter is what I was looking for here. I was not looking for refugees. I was looking for an astronaut. I was looking for, something fun. And so that kind of got me started. And then when I was writing my novel, I was trying to do research and ended up having to order a lot of the local books off of Amazon and send them to my mom's house in America and bring them home at Christmas because I just couldn't find them anywhere. And that kind of got me on a road. So then I ended up starting Bridge Books sort of out of a backpack 10 years ago. And it's still like a very small niche little shop. I mean, we're in a bigger physical space right now than we've ever had, which has been lovely. But yeah, I was sort of trying to figure out how to meet the demand. And I would say the thing that's really changed is that if I had that same experience with my goddaughter now, who's kind of, at that early reading age, that actually would not be the case. I think there has been a huge shift. There would be tons of picture books with black and brown kids, with South African stories, more languages. So it's been really interesting to watch. Yeah.
That's amazing. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit. But what's interesting is we talk now about how far we still have to go. with books in mother language, but we've actually really come incredibly far. We don't give credit. I mean, what you're saying is true. There was absolutely nothing, and we've come quite far, but still such a long journey to travel. And last but not least, we're joined by Stephanie Kitchen from the UK. Stephanie has traveled quite far to be here today on our panel. She is a co-director of the African Books Collective. She's a managing editor at the International African Institute at the University of London. She's undertaking research on African academic journals as part of a PhD, another doctor in our midst, as part of a PhD project at the Oxford International Centre for Publishing at Oxford Brookes University. Also, so much that you do, Stephanie. You put a lot of focus on African work that you're taking overseas to the UK, I'm assuming, by all of this. Where did this, a similar question to Griffin's, what's your origin story? Where did this interest stem from?
Thanks very much, Paige. I'm slightly dreading you were going to ask me about my origin story. I mean, I've been involved in African literature and African publishing since I was 22, 23. I studied French at university. I went to West Africa. I realised I hadn't learned anything about Francophone African writers despite having a degree in French literature. I started finding these books for myself. I mean, as Griffin was saying, I was sort of shocked in some naive way about the lack of provision. I sort of somehow thought when I grew up, I would get a job in publishing and sort of fell into African studies publishing. I live in Oxford, down the road from Nielsen Book Data, plenty of jobs here. But the one that really fascinated me was a first job with African Books Collective. I worked there for 6 or 7 years, moved to SOAS in London, but then came back 3 or 4 years ago as a part-time executive director when the sort of the old guard who were really involved in the founding of the company in the 90s finally retired. So ABC's been around since 1990, before the end of apartheid in South Africa, addressing these questions about lack of representation and so on in publishing for 35 years. Yeah.
You must have also seen a vast difference. I mean, like, we still have so much work to do, but I would imagine in all this time you've seen a vast difference in availability and what you've got at your disposal.
Yeah, I think if I talk to my sort of older colleagues, it is hard. I think it's still hard to run a company when margins are tight, when you're concerned about cash, when there are still all kinds of logistical issues. Just the one of the moment is, how do we pay these publishers in Chad, who we've nicely recruited into ABC to my delight, but there's then a financial issue with the banking system. It's the sort of constant infrastructural sort of challenges. But I think what is different from 30 years ago is this sense that we don't have to justify what we do anymore. I think those kind of early struggles that my colleague, just to even sort of justify support for African publishing, in a sense that's over. That battle has been won, and certainly in London at the London Book Fair in the UK, we're just seen as part of the publishing scene, and in many ways very positively, and also in the US. I mean, irrespective of all the issues at the moment, our book sales in the US actually counterintuitively this year are very strong. So yeah, I think that's probably the difference. The other obvious difference is the digitization and the digital revolution in the last 30 years. I mean, I started with, there was sort of dial-up internet and it was there, but we had a big warehouse full of books at great cost, and publishers were shipping books to us at their own cost, having not sold any books. Imagine now that's all done through digital file transfer and ebooks and so on. So those economies have shifted, and clearly I think African publishers have benefited from that. Yeah.
We couldn't have been doing any worse. So every little incremental improvement has been of benefit, I would imagine. So now that you've got an idea of who's on our panel, I wanted to get down to the question at hand. What this panel is really about is a group of booksellers and book-interested people and literary activists chatting about sharing African stories with the world and how we do that, and not just with the world, but in our own markets as well, because it's just as tricky. So I wanted to start with the question, what would you say the appetite is specifically in the market you deal with for specifically African stories compared to international stories? Obviously, Stephanie, in your case, that's, I would imagine, is a UK market, but I'm sure you'll You'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. So yeah, what is the appetite specifically in your market for African stories compared to international stories? Griffin, do you want to go first just because you're directly to my right?
Sure. I mean, we might be in a bit of a different situation than many other booksellers in the country because people come to us for that. But it has been interesting because we had a shop in London running for about 2 years that we kind of I merged back into town a few months ago. Um, but definitely in the city center, the kind of demand for like African nonfiction has been very high and kind of memoirs about liberation heroes, but um, not Mandela or kind of the people, I think the ones that people grew up learning about very heavily in school. People are really interested in Biko and Chris Hani and Samora Michelle and Thomas Sankara and different kinds of people. Um, and I think the it's really hard to match the supply and the demand because we also have a trouble like finding books sometimes, and people will come in looking for titles. Credo Mutwa is the one that comes up very often for us, and even though he's South African, some of his books too we have to order from the U.S. You know, we can't source them locally. Actually, only two are available locally, and for a while it was just Indaba My Children. And so you end up with a problem of price because the book's already not cheap, and then by the time you ship it, even if you can kind of aggregate an order and try and get some economy of scale on that. As a small bookshop, we usually can't. We're only going to order 10 or 20 from overseas at a time. It becomes too expensive for people. Like people just can't afford it. And I also find we've had this experience every time this year for the university students who are doing African Lit, and the titles that they're being told to read are only available in the libraries, and they're not available locally. We would have to order them from the US. And on student budgets, it's not an effective price point. So I think the demand is there, and there's a real mismatch between like how distribution works and how we connect just the really basic data about what books are available. And the other thing on the data issues, which has been on my mind a lot lately, is the language issue, because particularly for parents who want books in their home languages, a lot of times the title will be entered in a database in English, and then it'll say isiZulu in brackets or Setswana in brackets afterwards. But the Setswana speaking parent doesn't know the title in English necessarily. Like they know the book that they saw at their friend's house in Setswana that they're trying to match up with. So it becomes very tricky to try and match things up. And of course, like parents don't know ISBN numbers. That's not how, like, of all the things parents worry about, ISBNs are not high on the list, right? So it's just some really interesting kind of problems that I think are solvable. And I'm sure like Dewald will have much more insight on like kind of how data works. But it's to me that problem of matching the demand with what's available and getting the reader to the right book.
Right. What I'm curious about, so the people coming to us, what would you say if you could put a percentage to it? How many people want African stories and how many people are coming in for the new Patricia Cornwall or the new, what international stuff? What's the kind of demand in your store?
Yeah, we won't be indicative because we don't stock we don't hardly buy any new international titles except for kind of very, very, we stocked Flesh, that kind of thing. So almost everyone coming in is looking for an African book. Otherwise, they would go there. I mean, there's 70 other booksellers within 2 kilometers of here. And that's not a comment on what they're looking for versus what we have. We also don't carry Christian books because we have 5 Christian bookshops within 3 blocks. So there's no need for us to provide that service. But for us, it's very high, but we've also kind of established that niche.
Yes, yes. So, Dewald, this is an easy one for you. Just saying the appetite in your market for African stories compared to international stories.
So on any typical given year, so if we look at publishing geography, we do see a mix of locations that shape what's available in the South African market, with international editions, especially from the UK and the US, having a strong presence. I would say that they make up about 40% of books that sell through South African tills. And if you compare that with locally published titles, which still hold a meaningful share, and they do remain central to cultural identity in South Africa, they traditionally make up about 30% of sales through the South African panel. And then finally, other regions like Australia would contribute in smaller ways, making up about 5% of the panel. So to answer your question, I think it's about a third is probably a good estimate. A third of books that sell through South African tills were published in South Africa as well.
And would you say that number has grown if you had to look back historically?
Yes, yeah. With the COVID that kind of hit 5 years ago, I know it's probably a cliche to talk about by now as kind of an economic reason for less sales or less performance than people would have expected. The book sales have kind of plateaued since then, and it has stuck around 30%, so a third of book sales. With very slight growth compared to UK and international titles.
Oh, interesting. Wendy, I'm going to ask you next because, Stephanie, it's a slightly skewed question. And Wendy, you as a publisher and a bookseller, you might have two varying different kind of responses to this.
Yeah. I think just like Griffin's origin story, that's kind of how Somanami came to exist, because initially I was always very interested in book clubs, right? And in curating the book clubs, it got to a point where, people, the readers wanted to read more about other African countries. And we quickly came across the barrier of, but where are these books? They're not available locally. And we tried to partner with bookstores in Nairobi to kind of, help us get access to those books, because we could see on the internet that these books exist. But, now for reasons that I understand as a bookseller, bookstores are a bit hesitant or maybe unable to, scour the world for certain titles. And it just takes a different kind of belief and muscle to, go the lengths to get maybe a book published in Chad or, translated from Arabic to English, those kinds of niche titles, say a book from Eritrea. And so in a very ignorant but audacious way, we thought, how hard can it be, to actually be a bookseller? And the bookstore started off as as an online store. The stock used to live between our houses in an extra, in an extra room, and and it grew from there, because initially, we were a bit skeptical, and we thought maybe we're just two very particular readers who want a certain kind of story. But the reception in the market in Nairobi and soon enough across Kenya showed us that really people want to read African stories. And so we got from there and just started putting our weight behind that dream and that idea. And 5 years on, 2 outlets later in Nairobi, I think we can say definitively that, Kenyans want to read stories that, reflect their circumstances more and more. They're curious about the rest of Africa, the rest of the African diaspora, because granted, the West and American stories and UK stories have an outsized PR machinery. We know about Grisham, we know about Jane Austen, we know about Shakespeare, right? We don't need to to convince somebody, and tell them what those stories stand for. But there's that innate need to know, okay, what about South Africa? What happens in Uganda? I'm curious about that. And where do you go for those stories? And there's a huge gap. There's still not enough material to, to answer all those questions. And I guess, it leads me to what Jessica is asking in the chat about how come booksellers get the bag to become publishers. It's because you're also sitting with that question more and more and seeing how much we have to go in the gap. And so you ask yourself, okay, maybe there's more that I can do other than, curating and sourcing and stocking books. How about I become an even greater catalyst? So that's to say we have a long way to go.
Amazing, thank you. We are going to ask Dewald for all these statistics, but I want to go to Stephanie next. And I'm curious, Stephanie, who would you say is driving the interest in your market? Because we're in Africa. Who would you say is driving that interest? Is it is there a large British market hungry for African stories? Is it expats? Where are you seeing that drive from?
Thanks, Paige. I think it's important to say, first of all, that outside the African continent, where ABC is operating largely, but also to some extent in the continent that I'll talk about in a minute. I mean, at some level, almost all the books in African Books Collective could be considered specialist, right? So they're specialist academic works, specialist literary books in a kind of environment which is hugely culturally diverse and with big diasporas and is changing, of course, all the time. But nonetheless, if you go into an average secondary school and you ask the kids who Nelson Mandela is, maybe half would know, half wouldn't know. So we're in a very different environment, and in that sense, I would also say that our market is very much not only the UK. I wouldn't want you to sort of come away thinking, lots of people think ABC should have been started in the USA. Some people think ABC should be moved to Africa. These sort of discussions go on and around us all the time. I think it was a sort of accident that ABC was born in Oxford. It was obviously a very strong publishing centre in the 80s and 90s, or for much longer than that. But for whatever reason, ABC sort of landed in Oxford. The UK is an important market for sure, but we're also part of a European market. So the countries where we're selling the most books in Europe are Germany, Italy to some extent, and we hope, and increasingly France, although sort of French publishing is its own beast in many ways. North America has always been incredibly important for ABC. I think, North America sort of kept ABC going through some difficult times. Support from libraries, particularly academic libraries, support for our ebooks, and so incredibly important. We're seeing interest at the moment from Asia, from China. I mean, not particularly large sales, but publishers interested in what we're doing, publishers interested in licensing and rights. So that's very important. We're also seeing really nice kind of interest of the kind that Wendy's talking about. In fact, Wendy and I had a call last week from the continent itself. So an ebook publisher in Ghana wanting to license our books for sales into Ghana, which is sort of complex around price, but I don't want to think is impossible. I think sort of our next generation has to do this kind of thing. We have to really make particularly children's books, classic children's text, available affordably in the continent where and how we can. What else was I going to say? In terms of demand, the demand is growing. I think it always is going to grow. In that sense, this is a very sort of positive and healthy sort of activity to be involved in. There's a lot, I say a lot of talk, it's real, materials in African languages. We're constant, Somali children's books, fair Swahili, we've got a big Swahili list, again, from all over, from Scandinavia, from the US. And so certainly demand for publishers to publish books in African languages, and they are doing, which is what's really nice, So feeding that machine can sort of never be enough, but I think that there is demand for Nigerian languages in the US, Somali in Scandinavia, etc., etc., etc. And these digital economies do enable distribution of smallish numbers of books in specialist languages. Translation is another big area. These things aren't new, but I think that's really healthy. Even the francophone regions are publishing books in African languages as well as French. So yeah,
technology has made it easier. I'm wondering now, just in relation to what you've all been talking about, is the demand for fiction versus non-fiction in terms of African storytelling. Again, I can jump back to you, Griffin. The demand, do you see bigger in fiction, non-fiction for your African stories?
I think nonfiction is always quite high, especially if you think about the breadth that nonfiction includes. Like it's every cookbook and every, almost there's so much variety within nonfiction. I think we probably do sell a little more fiction than the national average would be, because nationally South Africans to adore nonfiction as well. But I find the problem that we tend to have a lot of political books with a fairly short shelf life. And the ones that people want are the one, from us anyway, are the ones that last a little bit longer. So more memoir, more um, relationship things, more finance, more business kinds of things. Not necessarily the latest scandal that has been unpacked at ESCOM or something.
Right. Stephanie, I would assume just because of the nature of what you do, it's nonfiction is a bit more your focus, right?
No, I mean both.
Necessarily.
In fact, our literature list is big. It's really big. And poetry list is big, children's books. But I mean, I hesitate to say this, but our kind of economic mainstay is academic work. So, you know, we always talk about children's literature and academic works, and our fiction list is big, our poetry list is big, but sort of regular, reliable money, you know, comes from it does also come from fiction sales, but because the price points are so much lower, the margins are smaller. So, I mean, my view is we need to go on with all these kinds of publishing. Yeah, but I mean, academic publishing is important. I mean, there are people in ABC who would favour us moving only to academic distribution. I think that would be a loss. It would be a cultural loss. It would be against the sort of the kind of original values of the organisation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Wendy, fiction, non-fiction, what are you seeing selling and being bought and being looked for?
I think from a general market demand perspective here in Kenya, of course, nonfiction trumps, fiction any day because it answers very basic questions of, how to overcome life's challenges or how to do things and how to get about, questions of money and relationships, religion. So from that perspective, nonfiction definitely trumps fiction. But for us specifically, our fiction leads because I think the kind of reader we're talking to is already inclined towards a certain, reading mentality. They've gotten to a point where they're looking for a certain niche. So most definitely they're looking for fiction. There's a huge appetite for African classics that we can hardly, satisfy because a lot of books that have been published over the last 50 years are out of print, are inaccessible. And so there's that demand. There's also a lot of demand for genre fiction done by Africans and Africans in the diaspora, just your everyday light reads, whether it's romance, crime, because as a reader, I think most readers get to a point where they start to get fatigued with literary fiction, or just want to switch up. So there's demand for that as well. So increasingly African classics and genre fiction.
Nice. I want to come back to the challenge of the African classics that you're struggling to get hold of. But first, Dewald, for some numbers: fiction versus non-fiction, demand, supply.
So just generally speaking, trade non-fiction dominates in the South African context. It's about 2/5 of spend that's normally spent on trade non-fiction. That would cover topics like ideas, culture, politics, religion, and self-improvement, like everyone else has alluded to already. These all make up important categories for South African readers. And then for the rest, adult fiction and children's, young adult, and educational books each claim about 1/4 of value spend. And then the subgenres, just broadly speaking, that matter are things like genre fiction at the moment with thrillers. Romance did very well recently with, it's kind of cliche by now, with the book doc sales that had happened straight after COVID. Fantasy was also an important category, kind of signaling an interest in escapism, again, after the kind of serious events and current things that were happening in 2020. We did see some of a shift for South African readers as well, picking up more fiction titles. It was slight, going from, let's say, the normal 28 to 29% to about 33%. And then personal development under nonfiction, aspirational narratives, they're quite important. And then also politics remains relevant, particularly current affairs remain relevant in the democratic and politically active South Africa.
Yeah,
just speaking.
broadly speaking. I want to ask about some challenges, and then I'm going to look to some of these. There are great questions coming in, so I want to look to those. But appetite is one thing, but appetite is irrelevant if there's limited or no distribution. And you've all kind of mentioned this in some way in your own realm. What for you is the biggest challenge that you face in distributing African literature within the continent, and is there a hack? Is there a way around that you see around that challenge? Maybe there isn't. Maybe you just want to talk about the challenges. But Wendy, do you want to chat first?
Yeah, I think the challenges are quite plenty, and they go all the way from the big macro challenges that we all have to live with to to specific challenges. And I think the biggest thing for especially Kenya in the last 2-3 years has been taxation and the regime, and just economic pressure that has pushed commodities higher. It's really affected the buying power of consumers, and you can see that directly affecting book sales, and especially for people in our category that don't do academic or curriculum books. So the leisure reader has to make that decision between maybe 3,000 shillings could buy me 2 or 3 books 3 years ago, but now it can only buy me 1.5 book, right? And so we've seen the average basket size go down. So there's really little that we can do about that in terms of the kind of economic and political environment that we live in. So we're just having to tighten our belts around that. The other challenge has been, of course, getting access to books, and we have creative ways around that. Whenever we try and collaborate a lot with other people in the book space. In Africa, there's a WhatsApp group called Book Farm, which is really helpful in terms of putting together booksellers, authors, and publishers around the continent. And we've made great friendships.
I think we've lost Wendy.
In that space, and sometimes it comes in handy because you book or put them in their suitcase, So, sorry?
No, I think you're back now. We lost you for just a moment. Yeah, you're back.
Okay, great. I'm sorry about that. Yes. So, where did I leave off? What was the last thing?
We got you. The suitcase. We got you. Just last a moment.
So just being a creative and just leaning on what we've always had, which is each other and community and collaborations. But I see great space in us doing more in terms of advocacy and like creating associations that actually champion, because I think that's one place that we can really be able to move the needle, as booksellers locally and even on a regional level. Just basically, I know everybody has a lot to do, but if we can spare time and attention and intention to, really collaborate and have strong advocacy associations, I think we can do a lot for all the challenges that we all face that are similar.
And I think you're quite involved with book clubs. Do you find that that's as much the kind of advocacy that you're talking about as well? Everything makes a difference. Everything feeds into it.
Yes, so the book clubs and the festivals that helps with the demand perspective, and creating visibility for certain titles which otherwise don't have any marketing platforms or budgets. But where I was leading with that is more on a structural perspective, in terms of maybe lobbying lobbying for books to
Tax-free.
not attract certain taxes, or those kinds of bigger questions, which, bigger challenges, which not one bookseller can tackle by themselves. It has to be on an industry perspective. So I think that's a space where I see an opportunity, a gap, and an opportunity that we can all, work towards, making the landscape better for all of us.
That would be the dream. That would make a huge difference. Griffin, distribution challenges for you?
I can go for days on this one, so you can dial me back. So there's a few things that some of them are unique to the South African environment, but I think might have similar situations. But basically, formal distribution's the monopoly industry in South Africa. There's only two really main distributors. They don't compete with each other because they have completely separate lists. So if you need book, if I'm looking for your book, I have to order it from one place, and there is no competition on price or service terms or any of those things. And interestingly, like in the e-commerce report that the Competition Commission came out with, they did point out very specifically to these issues, specifically around Media24 and the way that their publishing arms and their retail arms and their Takealot are so deeply integrated that they cannot be pulled apart, and that's actually an unfair business practice that needs to be redressed, where they made specific recommendations about how they need to unbundle some of those businesses so they're not so integrated. Because in reality, what that means is that as a bookseller, I am paying wholesale more for a book from Media24 than they are offering to the public on Takealot, which means that for their entire catalog, I will never compete on price. So I might be able to compete by hand selling the book and doing a really great job saying it's compelling, but there's really zero interest in expanding their market reach in that way. And I think for me, coming at this from a really privileged position of, I came into it with finance and a bank account, and I own a house, and I owned my car, and I have credit cards, and I have a savings account, hugely privileged to start a business. But if you are starting off with not that background, you will not be able to compete with any of those things. The other huge problem with distribution is that because there are so few of them, only the smallest one, Protea, is really willing to work with new entrants. And so even for me, with all of those benefits, right? I mean, not that I'm super rich, I am not in any way, but like I own a house, right? I could not get a credit line from any of the distributors to begin my business with. They wanted me to have 12 months of trading credit before I could start. And I don't think that has changed for new entrants. So the idea that you're coming into it as, say, that you are starting off and it's your first home business, right? You are starting from scratch. How do you stock your store if you need cash up front? And my first bookshop when I opened Bridge had maybe 2,000 titles. But if each of those 2,000 titles is wholesaling at 100 or 150 Rand, how do you have enough selection to be able to offer people a reasonable collection? And then you run into the other problem. The books that people come to ask us for are out of print or are not available or are only available overseas. Very much what Wendy was saying, like people come to us expecting we have every African classic ever written. And sometimes those books are 400 Rand being shipped from London, which I find to be insane. Like we have print on demand services in South Africa that would be totally well controlled. So, I mean, on those things, it's actually like deeply frustrating because it's so challenging to work with companies that are actually not that interested in working with us. And when I think about like the broader market and what Wendy was speaking about with workarounds, most of the market is not the numbers that we're kind of experiencing on our side or that are being tallied because most of the market is secondhand books. So the last time we did a bookseller survey in South Africa was 10 years ago. So it's very out of date considering COVID and all the things that have happened. But in Joburg, we had over 1,000 bookstores, like almost as many as Paris, more than Berlin, more than Sydney, more than Istanbul. But 90% of them are secondhand bookshops, selling secondhand books at much lower prices. And so we don't actually have a way to track that because the way that would need to happen is with some kind of computerized point of sale where someone can sit and generate an Excel sheet so that could be tabulated somewhere. But these secondhand shops are operating in a gray zone. I mean, if you've been to a secondhand shop, if you get a slip, it's handwritten on, carbon paper still, like it's not being put into a point of sale. So the reality is that we don't actually know what people are reading or how much they're paying for it. When we kind of triangulate like my work with the informal vendors, because we provide a wholesale service to them with the really interesting data that came out of the National Reading Barometer 2 years ago that the Xenix Foundation did. You can see in surveys, people say the price they're willing to pay is 150 Rand. That's what they think a new book should cost. But when they say where they want to buy it, they want to buy it at the post office, is the most popular choice people said they would like to buy a book, which I find fascinating, like just as a just it's just fascinating to me.
Wow.
But I think that informal market has also made huge inroads in dealing with the distribution challenge because they do it without using DHL. We had a customer in Germany decline a sale because the shipping was more than the book. It's insane. But to get books to Zimbabwe or Mozambique or Zambia or Namibia from here, people are putting it on the bus inside a shoebox and taping it shut
Um,
and paying 100 Rand or 200 Rand to distribute a box of books that would cost you 2,000 Rand to ship commercially. And I think there's a real interesting question around how do we tap into the networks that exist? Because people are reading books and distributing them around the region, but we can't see it and we can't track it. And then we don't have really interesting market research to know maybe everyone has decided to read Danielle Steele this year. Like we have no idea. Maybe everyone's super interested in ghost stories, or they're all wanting cookbooks, or they're all who knows what. But it would take a certain level of investment to deal with those challenges that I think, like you're not going to bootstrap that. It needs to be either government to reassign some of the funding that gets put into creation of books and supporting new titles, which I think is worthy. But I think there are so many programs to encourage new writers, and we do not have a shortage of new writers. We have a challenge of getting books to readers. So if we're
right.
not going to address that challenge, we could create 10,000 amazing books every year, and it won't matter if they can't get their way there.
It's
So to me, it's
systemic,
kind of figuring out
right?
like,
Yeah.
yeah, like, and how do
It's
we
what
bridge
Wendy
those
would say.
gaps?
Yeah. It's a
Yeah, exactly.
systemic issues that are almost greater than us, no matter how hard we try.
Or that,
Um,
as what he's saying, like just do collaboratively is the way to figure it out. Yeah.
right. Like we don't have enough on our hands already. Stephanie, I'm going to jump to you. And then we have so many amazing questions in the chat. I would love to cover a couple of them. So, Stephanie, I don't know, do you want to weigh in on distribution challenges?
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, I would follow with a lot of what Griffin said. I mean, perhaps first to say and to stress some of the positives, ABC largely doesn't have a distribution problem outside the African continent. So, we get books, we print locally, we supply ebooks, we feed Amazon and all the commercial services. There are many, many suppliers. I mean, that said, Baker and Taylor in the US is in trouble, and this is a serious point of stress for us because, it's a very reliable aggregator and an onward seller of print books. So that's something we're dealing with at the moment. That's to do with the collapse of the US library market, or that's what they tell us. But alternatives will sort of come into that stead. So I mean, I would say that's stressful, but not systemic in the way that there are issues in the African continent. We have similar problems to all of you. I mean, I'm sort of slightly against catastrophist narratives. I think there are differences in different countries. So Zimbabwe, for example, one can't even send free books, which we try to do all the time to authors, because of custom charges are just slapped on, as someone said, they have to go essentially illegally in a suitcase. So there are really, really bad cases like Zimbabwe, but then there are much, much more positive places like Kenya that Wendy's talking about. Ghana, we're trying to make arrangements with local booksellers, particularly through ebooks, to, really reduce prices, because price is the big issue, or it's one of the issues, the price and the economy issue. So even in South Africa, with it's got print on demand infrastructure, but if the books are coming from outside Europe and the production and the print infrastructure is essentially pricing in a European way, then it's not helping the end reader because the book is just too expensive. And that's really our experience in South Africa of, yes, the books can be made available from across the continent through Lightning Source, through Ingham, but the prices are priced on US production costs, so that just sort of kills the market. So there's a lot to be done around print infrastructure and pricing, and it's hard to see progress, frankly. I mean, South Africa's got POD, but there isn't anywhere, I haven't seen it anywhere else. So that's a problem. I think ebooks, there's a chicken and egg problem where you don't have the print infrastructure problem, but because of fear of piracy and so on, some publishers are afraid, with good reason, to make their ebooks available. I think in Kenya that's a major issue. So you get a lot of illegal circulation of books.
That's
Yeah,
very
maybe I should stop because it's like the rest of you, I could talk. I think we need to focus on what we can do. Um,
right.
there's a lot of positive sort of discussion, I think, in the continent around these sorts of collaborations at the moment. I don't think we want to be having this discussion in 20 years. But there are some really hard issues around lack of digital print infrastructure that are not going to help solve. And even, South Africa's terrible postal service, all these things are sort of feeding the beast. So there are things we can do around ebooks. There are things we can do, country to country. And we need to focus on that. There isn't a single solution, I don't believe,
Well, there
for
are too
this.
many problems for a single solution, I think. Too many challenges. Um, I do want to get on to projects, but there are so many amazing questions. Dewald, there's one specifically here for you. Um, Mitchell Hunter is interested in the role of libraries as buyers of locally published books. For example, the city of Cape Town has a book budget of 10 million rand. He wants to know, Dewald, do you have insight on who's buying the books in South Africa and the proportion that comes from libraries and schools versus the individual consumers? We have 6 minutes. I'm going to try and get in one more after this.
Well, I have a very short answer for that, and it's unfortunate that we don't measure any institutional sales. So the book scan measure that we do try to measure is just for the average or the everyday book consumer, and we would typically try to exclude or not include at least any institutional sales that come from libraries, schools, or government procurement, things like that. So I don't have any specific figures that splits out, how big institutional sales are versus the consumer market. But what I can, just as a brief, just to give some slight numbers at the end of this call, what I can say is that we typically measure, or we have measured for the last 49 weeks, we have measured 1.7 billion rands worth of sales, and that's across about 6.7 million units that has gone through the South African book market panel in 2025 for the first 49 weeks.
And they say people don't read anymore. I would love, like Stephanie said, I would love to end. I wish we had more time because there's so many amazing questions. I'd like to end on as positive a note as possible. I'm going to start with you, Griffin, because the project that I know about with you is the mapping a literary district in Joburg, which I think is incredible. And I'm sure each of you are involved in a project somewhere that's close to your heart, that speaks to the opportunity out there. If you could each briefly touch on these projects, I think that would be a lovely way. And then if we've got time, we'll take another question. Sorry, we've violently run out of time. Go for it, Griffin.
Yeah, I mean, the Lit District project is trying to connect the city library with the 70 booksellers in the neighborhood. Most of them are informal sellers, the vast majority of them, and most of them are from other parts of Africa. So it's definitely a way to highlight the very huge reading culture that exists, that Joburg is a city that reads, that we do have a way to reimagine the life of the city based on the books that flow through it in a really positive and dynamic way, because you figure if you have enough readers passing through every day to support 70 booksellers, even if they're relatively small, some of those booksellers are putting children through varsity based on what they're selling from a stand on the pavement. I think they're selling a lot more than we are realizing, and that's really important to recognize that the reading culture and the book buying culture is bigger than what we document.
Amazing. Wendy?
I think for me, where I started is where my heart still is, which is in reading communities. And I've been very intentional in terms of, growing that, because at the end of the day, I think the reader is always going to be the boss of the industry. And so I'm very intentional in terms of growing reading communities, supporting people to just start book clubs. For instance, I have a free tutorial, just letting people know this is how you can start a book club. I'm always curating reading lists for book clubs, because I think the more people feel empowered, and the more books become not just things, but experiences shared amongst friends and contexts and cultures and conversations, then the book becomes what it's supposed to be, which is this conduit for life and experiences and imagination and travel. So I think clubs are incredibly important, and I continue to do what I can about that.
I'm going to reach out to you for that guideline. Can I ask you, there's a question here from Jessica. Is there a big informal bookseller culture in Kenya? And then I will come back to the other two panelists. Is there a big informal bookseller culture in Kenya similar to what Griffin was talking about in Joburg?
Oh my gosh, yes. So part of the unintended, or part of the consequence of books being formal books, or books in the mainstream being so expensive as a result of all the things that we've discussed, is that it fuels a huge piracy industry, and how that translates. It's in the booksellers on the pavement, and if you walk on the streets of Nairobi in this downtown or CBD, 100 meters, you will meet maybe 10, 15 booksellers. Somebody with just a small case of books, and the books that they are selling are, are pirated copies in broad daylight. Of course, there's a huge gap in terms of enforcement of what IP looks like. But readers, it's also fueled by the demand that, readers want to read, but are the books at a price point that I can afford?
I don't have the money.
Yeah, so I think that's where actually the biggest money goes through, like Griffin is alluding to. We just don't know how much, but you can just look and see that, based off of how many people are practicing this kind of informal book selling, we can only imagine that that's where the market is.
Thank you, Wendy. Jessica, can I have 3 more minutes just to chat to Stephanie and Dewald about their projects, and then we'll wrap it up. Stephanie?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you. So, I mean, I think we generally are quite positive in ABC, where we've taken a handful of Francophone publishers. So, really, I think making Francophone publishing much more visible to the world. Certain issues with Amazon France and French publishing, but, we're working through those. So that's great news. I mean, that's a third of the continent being far less ignored. And the kinds of problems those publishers have are really quite similar to the publishers in Kenya, experiencing in the 1980s and 90s. So you really see and compare, and I do sort of think of Kenya as a real success story because it has supported independent publishing very consistently over the long haul, going back to Henry Chikava and so on. And I think that is what's working. We can't do that much about the multinationals, the monopolies, and so on. But we can support independent publishing in the continent. The other thing we're doing is taking on a handful of journals to distribute those in international channels. That's a very sort of nascent project, but I hope to be able to talk about that in future. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Dewald?
Yeah, I guess I will just finish off by saying that we at Nielsen are always kind of looking to improve our coverage, getting a finer measure of trends in the South African market, and that with our recent direct involvement in the South African market in the BookScan and book data services, we hope to provide better and more accurate information on trends that are taking place in the South African market. Trying to show people what's selling, what books people are buying, what people are reading.
Yeah, that's so useful. That information is so useful to everybody. Colleen Furry, you had such great questions, and I'm sorry that I didn't get to them. We just drastically ran out of time. I want to thank Jessica at Catalyst Press, Griffin. Thank you, Dr. Griffin Shea. Thank you so much, Dewald, Stephanie Kitchen and Wendy Njoroge. Thank you so much for coming and giving us your time and your knowledge. I wish we could talk for another half an hour. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for everybody. Thank you so much for everybody who came. We will have the recording up on Monday. I unfortunately failed in my recording duties and missed the first few minutes, including the introduction to Wendy. So apologies, Wendy. And the introduction of Paige, but I'll record a little thing to add to that. But again, thank you so much. This is our last panel for Reading Africa Week. Of course, we think Reading Africa should happen all year round, but we do this annual push, and it does seem to increase attention, and we're very grateful for everybody that's participated, for coming, and for all of the panelists. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Bye-bye.